Deep Dive Armor Revamped. Since the last year we have been making large changes to the balance of our game. So far the focus has been on infantry weapons, but with the latest build we have finally made our first changes to the vehicles. In the blog spot we want to take a deep dive into why we wanted to make changes, what we changed and how this should affect the gameplay. This patch holds some of the biggest changes we have made to tank combat in a very long time. It is therefore possible some elements are a little rough and some changes may have some foreseen consequences. In the future more patches will be made for the tank balance to make sure issues are resolved and we make the game as balanced as possible. Based on the community's feedback, we have already released hotfixes to solve the most pressing matters. We are currently not planning to hotfix any other aspects of the tank changes yet. We need to see how the correct settings affect the gameplay. Future changes will be based on both community feedback and our statistics. So the first changes is to the AP shells. AP shells versus APCR shells, where AP stands for armor piercing and APCR is armor piercing composite rigid, I think. Why would you ever use AP shells once you have unlocked the APCR shell for your tanks? Well, the previous build there was no reason to. They were a bit cheaper in use, but if you wanted quality you had to use the APCR shells. In this build we have changed that both AP shells and APCR shells now have their own strengths and weaknesses. We will not go into every single detail of what we changed, but we will take a look at the most important differences. A change that we have made to both shells is to increase minimal values and decrease maximum values. If a shell is used to do a minimum of 1000 and maximum of 1600 damage, now they will do a minimum of 1200 damage and a maximum of 1400 damage. This decreases the randomness and makes the combat more predictable, and with that more controllable. When we look specifically at the AP shells, we have decreased the tank's penetration values. This means that it will be more difficult to take on a tank with thick armor. In exchange, however, we have massively increased the damage this weapon does. On every tank in the game, AP shells now do 20% more damage than APCR shells, which in some cases means AP shells now do 50% more damage than they did in the previous build. AP shells are at their best when taking on an enemy tank that is lightly armored. When you are driving a medium tank and your enemy is the light tank, using AP shells can kill the enemy quite a bit faster than using the APCR rounds. When it comes to the APCR shells, the penetration values are on average about the same as they were before. As they were always higher than the AP shells, that of course still the case. Damage has been increased by a small percentage compared to the previous build. When an AP shell is unable to get through the armor of an enemy tank, the APCR shells in many cases will be able to. It may do less damage on paper if the AP shell does not penetrate, but the APCR shell does. The APCR is certainly the way to go. Well, penetrating the enemy tank. As mentioned before, the APCR has a better chance to penetrate the enemy tank AP shell. Better chance to penetrate the enemy tank AP shells. But how does the penetrating an enemy work exactly? Let's take a look. So the basics is very simple. Every shell has a minimum and maximum penetration. If the armor is lower than the minimum penetration value, it penetrates. If the armor is higher than the maximum penetration, it does not penetrate. If it is between the two, sometimes it penetrates and sometimes it doesn't. There are, however, more elements to the system. The first one being the angle of which you hit the enemy tank. We have decreased an angle correction value, meaning that the angle is now more important than it used to be. When the angle which the shell hits the tank is too large, the shell may be completely bounce off. If it does hit the tank properly, a high angle can still affect the difficulty a shell has to penetrate. The higher the angle, the further you increase your effective armor. So the higher the angle, the smaller the chance your shell goes through the enemy armor. The last important factor is the armor hull degradation system, which is crap by itself, but okay. After every shot, both when penetrating without penetrating, a certain percentage of the damage goes to the armor of the tank. The more damage the armor takes, the thinner the armor becomes. If you take an enemy tank which you cannot penetrate on your first shot, hit him several times and you will wear his armor down until you can penetrate him. The system was introduced quite few years ago, however, complaint often was the armor went down too quickly and thick armor just didn't really help you that much in combat anymore. We have tripled the health of the armor, meaning it will now take a lot more shells to penetrate the armored opponent. So careful when engaging a tank with strong armor. He may be able to penetrate you even if you cannot penetrate him. Flanking is always a good option, as the armor on the side and on the back is always thinner than the armor on the front. The side armor may be weaker than the front, 37mm AP rounds still won't do penetrate. A purpose for every tank. Just like replacing AP shells with the APCR shells, in former builds it was always better to eventually change the highest tier tank of a certain class. The Panther tank would always be better than the Panzer III tank. We wanted to create a system where every tank is useful in its own way. Every tank has its own role, strengths and weaknesses. The system we have introduced mostly targets light tanks and medium tanks, but does not influence the tank destroyers. The heavy tank have seen some other reforms, which will be talked about later. The way it works is that the higher tier tank you can pick, the better the tank in tank versus tank combat. They tend to have thicker armor, their shells can penetrate more enemy armor, and they even do more damage. If you see a hostile Panzer III and you yourself are driving on an E8 tank, you can have some good laugh before firing your first shell. That enemy tank doesn't stand a chance, but when the enemy only has a light tanks or no tanks at all, I would rather drive a Panzer III than an E8 tank into combat. When shooting high explosive shells on an enemy infantry, the shells on your Panzer III have an explosive range of 12 meters, while the E8, probably it's an easy 8, only has the explosive range of an 8 meters. The actual kill range, if the enemy is within 6.5 meters from the explosion of a Panzer III shell, he's dead. If the Easy 8 tank only kills you 3 meters away from where the shell lands. So put it very short, if the enemy has a tank of the same or even higher class that your team does, you probably want to spawn the highest tier tank you can. But if you are facing infantry, the lowest tier tank is much more effective. Of course, in most trees there are 3 tanks, so what does that one do? Well, that one is simply in the middle. The Soviet T-34-76 has some decent anti-tank capabilities and can also kill infantry in a 5 meter radius when firing his highly explosive shell. One specific tank to mention is the Su-76 Soviet tank destroyer. The Su-76 is the only tank destroyer that is countered as a tier 1 medium tank. Just like the T-28 Soviet tank, they used to have a kill range of 7.0 meters. Their two tanks have the strongest high explosive shells in the game, so while the Su-85 may be your best pick when taking on an enemy tanks, the Su-76 may now also be interesting to use in certain situations. Now the next balance is how the tanks versus tanks go in heavy tanks branch. So rock, paper, heavy tank. The heavy tanks are now grouped that will need the most fine-tuning into the future. In the last outfit we have already increased the penetration values of the Tiger II, the IS-2 and the Pershing. This way they can in most situations penetrate each other. The Tiger II should be because of lose some of its dominance. The Tiger II should because of that lose some of its dominance. How does the balance work on the highest level? Well, they are balanced by a rock, paper, scissors system. So the Tiger 2 is countering the Tiger 1 is countering the IS-2, then the IS-2 is countering Tiger 2, then the Tiger 2 is countering KV-85, and then the KV-85 is countering Tiger 1. And then the Tiger 1 is countering Pershing, Pershing is countering Tiger 2, Tiger 2 is countering Jumbo, Jumbo is countering Tiger 1. And then the Pershing is countering IS-2, IS-2 is countering Jumbo, Jumbo is countering KV-85, and KV-85 is countering Pershing. The Tiger 1 does less damage than the IS-2, but due to the much faster loading time, it has a small advantage over the IS-2. The IS-2 with the APCR can penetrate the Tiger 2, and because it is much of its high damage, should win that fight. The Tiger 2 doesn't have the highest damage, but does have a very thick armor. The KV-85 will not be able to penetrate that, but the KV-85 has the fastest rate of fire of any heavy tank, and it should be able to do damage quicker than the Tiger 1 can. The Tiger 1 also does more damage than the Pershing. The Pershing does more damage than the Tiger 2. The Jumbo cannot penetrate the Tiger 2, and the Tiger 1 cannot penetrate the Jumbo. And last but not least, the Pershing does more damage than the IS-2. The IS-2 does more damage than the Jumbo. The KV-85 cannot penetrate the Jumbo, but it does more damage than the Pershing. This is at last the theory, and the coming months we will see if the changes to the heavy tanks will actually affect the effect we hope for. In most cases, it also does not mean a tank is completely unable to fight another tank. We do at least hope that the correct changes make sure that all heavy tanks can perform well, and we do not have a tank that can almost not be defeated. More changes have yet to be made to the tanks, but these were the biggest and most important changes. We have hoped to have informed you enough on how the system works and how to use it to your advantage. Now it's time to use this information in combat. Equip your tanks with the correct munitions, spawn them into combat, and wreak havoc. So basically the most important update is that the penetration values for the angled shot have been modded a little bit, so now actually positioning your tank at a slight angle actually helps, but the armor degradation is still crap, so there we go. Also now you figured out that the highly explosive shells have increased the radius, although they already had that as far as I knew, but now you know how small they are for the high tier tanks. That's all for it, see ya.